got me going? What started it? I guess the answer to that question is that I am not very good with a remote control of a television. That's the simple answer, because one evening I was watching the nightly news and I tried to turn off the television, and instead I flipped channels, and there in front of me on the screen was an image of a 5-year-old girl who had suffered 90% burns in a house fire, and she was making pretend cups of tea in a plastic Wendy house for a cameraman. And I was transfixed by that image and ended up watching the 1-hour program that told her story and what had happened to her over the previous 3 years. When she was 2, she suffered very badly in a house fire, and the expectation was that she would not survive, but she did. And over the next 3 years, she had 19 operations, if I remember correctly, because effectively she needed to be put in an artificial skin, grafted skin bodysuit so that she would survive. And I was exceptionally moved by this little girl's story. This little girl was called Terry, and she lived 40 miles north of London. And so I called a couple of friends of mine and I said, would you get in a swimming pool with me and swim a distance equal or equivalent to the English Channel, the distance between the UK and France, which is 22 miles. But let's do it in a swimming pool, because I'm not brave enough or fit enough to do the real thing. And we'll raise some money for this little girl because I think she's going to need it. And what started as 3 people swimming, my 2 friends said yes, they would take part. And our aim was to swim about 6 months later. What started as 3 people swimming over the period that followed, so some 7 weeks, developed into 150 swims in 75 countries involving 10,000 people. Because there's an awfully large group of people out there who get it. And when they heard that this little girl needed some help, and why don't we swim and raise some money via effectively sponsored swims, a lot of people said yes. And there is a website, swimforterry.org, where we still today, some 15 years on, we show what we did. And in essence, one of the things that catalyzed Swim for Terry, which went on to be highly formative when I then set up a malaria charity, was that I felt that it would be really nice to have some people swimming for this little girl in different parts of the world, because it really doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you suffered 90% burns to your body, it really doesn't matter where that child is. Surely, if we hear about it, we want to support that individual. So I phoned a nice man called Steve in New York, and I said, never spoken to the guy before, just searched on Google, swimming New York, and up came a telephone number and somebody who was clearly involved in the swimming organization. And I said, hello, Steve, my name is, daftest question you're going to get all week. Who the flipping heck do you know in your town who would be prepared to round up a group of people and on this day swim this distance, equivalent to the English Channel, and raise some money for a child who'd suffered 90% burns in a house fire? And Steve's response was the same response I got from a nice man called Brian in California, somebody in Beijing, Shanghai, then Singapore, Abu Dhabi, Rome, and Paris. Very short calls, people I'd never met ever in my life. I just searched on the internet and came up with a number, and I spoke to a person. And Steve's response was me. I'll do it. Of course you will. How could we not do it? And so what started was 8, 9, 10 individuals agreeing to round up some unknown group number of people and swim in what was then going to be 6 months' time and raise money for this little girl who lived thousands of miles away from them. And that developed into, as I mentioned, 150 swims in 75 countries involving 10,000 people. And we raised many, many hundreds of thousands of pounds. And all of that money went to Terry's trust fund. Nothing went on anything else. So we didn't have organizational fees. We had no costs at all. And I made sure that the people who were involved in Swim for Terry were aware that this was for real. I mean, you know, which idiot would call you from London and say, would you do a swim for a child with 90% burns if it wasn't genuine? But you could find out about Terry. There was plenty of information on her that this child existed. And importantly, I said, don't send me any money. Send it directly to her trust fund. And you can verify that it is her trust fund. And that was a very good way of making sure that people knew that what they were getting involved in was genuine, because that's something that, you know, today and even 15 years ago, if not before, we have to be careful of, you know, is something for real? And that was an incredibly rewarding experience, humbling in many ways, because I don't think I had any other response than me when I asked various people along the way, I need advice and guidance. Who do I talk to who could help me do this? Because I can't do it on my own. And that extended to people who I asked to copy the main videotape from the television company. They sent it to me and I had it copied onto video footage and DVDs, those old formats these days, so that I could send the 1 hour documentary to all of these people around the world who were swimming, so they knew what, or more importantly, who they were swimming for. And so that took place in 2003. Television program was aired in June 2003. And then we swam in December. In fact, one of my friends said in June, I've got to get in shape to do a swim like that. So we were going to be swimming 7 or 8 miles each. And another friend said, I've got to change my shape, which always amused me. But the 3 of us swam on the day with many other people all over the world. And that was a pretty nice sentiment as well. The fact that there were people in many different parts of the world doing exactly what we were doing, swimming up and down a pool in some shape or form. And we were asking for sponsorship money, which obviously people gave willingly. There was no pressure there for people to give. And a lot of money was raised, hundreds of thousands of pounds. And during the process of developing what became known as Swim for Terry, a very nice Australian man called Walter called me up and said, we're going to take part in Swim for Terry. But how the flipping heck have you done this and got so many people involved in so many countries in a very short space of time? In fact, we had 30 countries involved within the first 7 days, as it turned out. And his question to me was, what are we doing next year? And I said, well, we haven't done Swim for Terry yet. That takes place in December and that's 5 months away. But, oh, I don't know, maybe we'll get 1 million people to swim. And it was a throwaway line. And Walter's response was, that's terrific. That means we only need 999,998 more people because I'm in. And it set me thinking. Over the subsequent weeks, and more specifically after we'd done Swim for Terry, I wondered, given the reaction we'd had to Swim for Terry with people swimming in amazing parts of the world, do have a look at swimforterry.org and see where we all swam. Very old website. The design is way outdated, but hey, it's the content and you can get the idea of what we did. I wondered if we could get 1 million people to swim for something else, for some cause we might determine. And so I set about thinking about 2 things. Firstly, what would we swim for? Which cause would we swim for if we had 1 million people swimming? And I guess the distilled version of my thought process was to say, I don't think it's something that is a developed world problem. I don't think it's cancer or heart disease. I think there's enough money going into those areas. I'm really interested in where we could have a lot of impact if we got a lot of people to do something. Where could we have the most impact or a very high level of impact? And that led me almost inevitably to a developing world situation. And then you start to think of HIV/AIDS, malaria, TB, landmines, fresh water, diarrhea. All of these are significant problems. Obviously, some of them in that list quite different. And when I did a little bit of research on each of these causal areas, HIV/AIDS at the time, and arguably still, was getting reasonable amount of funding put behind it. So I counted that one out, and for various reasons counted out the others. TB, incredibly difficult, complicated for a variety of reasons. Landmines, political. Fresh water, enormous. Diarrhea, big problem, and again, quite complicated and linked to sanitation and many other things. And malaria had a few interesting characteristics that I discovered at the time. The first and the most stunning, I guess, and shocking was that at that time, so we're talking about 2003 here, early 2004, 747s full of children under 5 died from malaria every day, daily. And that, to me, I remember the word that struck me was slaughter. That is slaughter. If we went down to the end of our local runway and we saw 2 747s collide and explode, which is a horrifying image, particularly for those of us, most of us, many of us these days who, travel on, airplanes. And we then saw that another 3 times or more. And I said, same time, same place tomorrow. I mean, that would have an enormous impact on us. Well, that was going on daily, just out of sight. So that struck me. I was also struck by the fact that malaria was then, and largely is still today, certainly then, the biggest, one of the biggest killers of pregnant women in the world. And the reason that under 5s and pregnant women are so affected by malaria is because pregnant women have a compromised immune system when they're with child, and children under 5 are still developing their immune system. So they're much more susceptible to the malaria parasite and it overwhelming them and causing severe illness or worse, dying. And the other piece of the malaria jigsaw puzzle, if I can phrase it that way, is that the most effective way of preventing malaria, given the malaria-carrying mosquito bites between 10 o'clock at night and 2 in the morning, is to have people sleep under a long-lasting insecticide-treated net. Because even if that net has holes and rips and tears, which inevitably occurs in nets in some of the very challenging environments in which they're distributed, because a mosquito doesn't do an aerobatics maneuver through a hole, but lands on the net, migrates to the hole, and in doing so picks up insecticide, which causes knockdown, effectively kills it. It's an incredibly effective way, this $5 net, as was then, $2 per net today, some 15 years on, a highly effective way of protecting people when they're asleep at night. And just reflect perhaps for a moment that if any of us, when we go to sleep tonight, imagine somebody just opened that door and released 15 or 20 mosquitoes into the bedroom and closed the door again. And those mosquitoes were malaria carrying, so could deliver malaria, you wouldn't get a wink of sleep. And that's the situation for hundreds of millions of people when they go to sleep at night. And so back in, still today, which we'll come on to, but we've certainly made progress over the last 15 years as I'll cover. But going back to 2004, early 2004, I thought, well, why don't we try and get 1 million people to swim, and let's see if we can raise some money to do something about malaria, and let's buy a whole bunch of nets and protect a whole bunch of people. 2 people sleep under each net. So at the time, $5 for the net plus another $3 to distribute it perhaps, you're looking at very few dollars to cover 2 people for 3 years. So that was a no-brainer for me in terms of, malaria, if we could get 1 million people to swim. I mentioned that I was thinking about 2 things. The second thing I was thinking about was, how are we going to get 1 million people to swim? And I tend to have an approach sometimes that is what I call the 20-minute approach. And I think about that thing that I'm going to try and do or achieve. And I think, how could I do that in 20 minutes? So I can do lots of research and prepare and ask for opinions and guidance and people's, expert ideas. But once I actually then press the button and do something, I've got 20 minutes to achieve that. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of poetic license that has to be given. But my answer to how do I get 1 million people to swim in 20 minutes was, I'm going to phone 20 organizations, spend a minute on the phone, and ask each of them to give me 5,000 people to swim. And that will give me 100,000 people and that will be a credible platform to launch World Swim Against Malaria and see if we can get to 1 million people. And in essence, that's what I did. I drew up a list of those people that I would call: the British Army in the UK, US Triathlon, Aussie Master Swimming in Australia, the New Zealand Secondary School Sports Council, the NZSSC, marvelous group of people, and others. And I went about initially calling the head of physical training in the British Army. And without going through a few, albeit wonderful stories of people I met through that period, I managed to get, perhaps I'll just mention that when I met a lovely man called Colonel Ted Martin, who was head of physical training at the British Army, and I went to see him, and I explained I was going to try and get a million people to swim. And I guess in my conversation with him, I had 15 seconds on the phone to interest him in my next 45 seconds and interest him in the next 4 minutes, so I could spend a few minutes talking to him about what I was going to try and achieve and why. I went to see Colonel Martin, and at one point when I summarized what he was saying to me about his job, I said, so really all I would like you to do, Ted, is send an email to your 350 physical training instructors and ask if some of them would organize a swim. And if 100 of them said yes and got together 50 people, so wives and husbands and girlfriends and boyfriends and children and people working on the bases they might be stationed at and so on, we could get to 5,000 people. And he said to me, why would I send an email? And that was the moment at which I thought, oh dear, this man is in charge of physical training at the British Army. He has quite a big job. And I have turned up and he doesn't know me. And I've asked him to help me out with my little charity thing. And he's about to tell me that, much as though it might sound interesting, he's really rather busy. But instead what he said was, why would I send an email to my 350 direct reports and ask them to do something? I'll just flipping tell them. And that was a punch the air moment for me, because here was an individual I had not known a few days ago. I'd never met him. Yet the humanity he showed, if you like, that however busy he is, and boy was he a busy individual, he was prepared to help out, because he could see that what we were at least trying to do was galvanize a whole group of people to do something that would fairly fundamentally affect the lives of people, none of whom we were ever likely to meet. And he was a very special man at the start of, in a sense, the World Swim journey. And I then spoke to 11 other people and managed to persuade all of them, I'm pleased to say, to give me 5,000 people swimming. I say give me. None of us knew who those people would be. I mean, they obviously had an idea who they would put this out to, and they had a confidence they would deliver 5,000 people. And if they delivered 4,000, so to speak, nobody's going to sue anybody. It's sort of all best efforts. But the 13th person I went to strategically was a very nice man called Simon Ryder. And he happened to be president of Speedo. And so I went to see him and explained I had 60,000 people signed up across organizations across the world, and largely brand name organizations. It include the BBC, it included, who else did it include? The modern pentathlon movement across the world, in many, many countries. And Simon's reaction was swimming, global, terrific cause, no brainer. And I think he might have actually said, how much money do you want? And I said, I don't want any money, just want 5,000 people swimming. And so in a sense that brought to the project very many of the world's most significant Olympic gold medalist swimmers, because they were allied to and connected to Speedo. So that gave us an element of marketing as things rolled forward. People like Michael Phelps, who is, I think still our most decorated Olympic swimmer in the world. And he and many others with extraordinary talents gave of their time incredibly kindly and said, you know, we'll swim and we'll get involved in this too. And as I like to phrase it, it doesn't matter how fast Michael Phelps or others swim. Their sentiment was, if I take part in World Swim Against Malaria, I count as one person. And if you take part, then you count as one person too. And that had a nice resonance for me that you know, we're all the same, really, particularly in this endeavor. So that was back in 2005. We ended up with 250,000 people swimming. So we failed to get 1 million people. And that was as a result of our big push, if you like, for having people involved, coinciding with Hurricane Katrina, when 1,000 people lost their lives in the floodwaters of New Orleans. So it would have been wholly inappropriate to be really pressing some of the messages about people swimming at that time. But anyway, we had 250,000 people swim in 2005. And that was the start of what then became the Against Malaria Foundation, because although we ran World Swim in subsequent years, 2 years later and another 2 or 3 years later, what became clear is that people were starting to identify with donating money, 100% of which was used for nets. And then we worked with partners who'd fund the non-net costs, so the shipping costs and distribution costs in country. And so people wanted to just give us money rather than swimming and fundraising. So World Swim Against Malaria became the Against Malaria Foundation, and hence the, if you like, Against Malaria as the website address became our natural home. That was 15 years ago, and we went through 6 or 7 years of raising $1 to $2 million a year. And what was very important for me was that 100% of the money that the public gave us bought nets, and not a cent went on anything else. And that was the case then, and is still the case today. So that if somebody gives us $10, we will buy $10 worth of nets, and not a cent will go on anything else. And that is because whilst we do have very modest level of central costs, they're already covered. So that any new donation that comes in just buys nets. And as I mentioned, we have partners who fund the non-net costs. It's not as though the net arrives on a magic carpet flying through the air. Somebody picks up those costs. So we fund nowadays the $2 for a net, and somebody else funds the $1.50 for the non-net costs. And that's a very effective partnership in all the countries in Africa in which we work. So for the first 10 years, AMF as an organization was 2 people. So it was just me and a chap called Andrew Garner. Andrew and I worked together in a previous life. He was my head of technology in a previous life. And he agreed to join me in seeing if we could do something with World Swim Against Malaria. And in fact, it's Andrew who put together the still rather fabulous, I think, swimforterry.org website. And he did that pro bono in his spare time while he was working during the day. Again, showed terrific willingness to put himself out and help without being paid. And then I sort of hired him back into AMF, if you like. And so the 2 of us ran AMF for 10 years. Andrew did all the technology and I did all the other stuff, albeit because I am completely shameless, I was keen to try and gain support from corporations where it was needed without paying, because I felt that nobody needed $5 for their work more than 2 children in Africa needed $5 for a bed net. And so, slightly more politely than I'm about to put it, but I called a number of organizations and said, please will you help me, but I'm not going to pay you, because you don't need $5 more than a couple of children in Africa need a bed net. And so that brought in a whole series of organizations that can be seen on the Against Malaria website under the About Us pro bono section. So Citibank agreed to do all our banking pro bono. PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, agreed to do our accounting pro bono. Microsoft agreed to help in a variety of ways, and another 147 organizations with translations, with all sorts. In fact, translations was a very humbling example of how people were willing to help. an example of the marvelous people I've come across over the last 15 years, I decided it would be courteous to translate the website into 10 languages, because I'd rather have people in Spain and France and in China and in Italy reading the website in their language. And so 12,000 words needed to be translated. So I wrote to, for example, 48 professional translators who work from German to English and vice versa, and asked if 4 would be willing to translate 2,000 to 3,000 words each. And in that way, we could get the website translated for free. And I asked if it could be done pro bono. And within 24 hours, 44 of those 48 individuals wrote back and said, yes, they would do it. So we could have translated the AMF website, or the World Swim website as it was then, 11 times over for free. And that was incredibly humbling, particularly when that was repeated identically across 10 other languages. So in a short space of time, over a number of couple of short months, we translated the website for free, but didn't spend any money on it. So no money needed to be diverted from funding life-saving, illness-averting bed nets. And the same approach was important to me in all other areas, such that for the first 10 years, the only central costs we had as an organization, literally the only thing we had to spend money on, was Andrew's salary, because he needed to earn a salary, obviously. And that's it. No banking, no accounting, no legal, no website, no translation, no nothing. So we could be very efficient with the money that was given to AMF. And that was fantastic to be a part of that, with so many people being willing to help. And I guess there was no particular trick to making that happen. Arguably, it was just being willing to ask people and give a short description of why we were doing what we're doing, stopping people dying and falling sick, and how we were going to go about it. And people agreed to help us. And it is a source of some pride that 15 years on, no organization has ever stepped away from assisting us. And I suppose there's been an element of strategy in there, in that what I've asked of people has been modest going forward. So it might be that there's an initial number of hours worth of help from a legal firm. We've had 17 legal firms working for us around the world at various times, setting up charitable organizations and in other ways. But then the subsequent draw on their time, if you like, has been really low. And so that's sustainable pro bono support. And it just means we can protect more people, because we don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars funding things that otherwise we might have to fund. So that first 10 years was just Andrew and me, and a lot of volunteers and a lot of support from various organizations, corporate organizations. And so I met lots of, really wonderful people that were willing to help in that way. And then we started to increase the revenue that came into AMF. And I think over one 3 or 4 year period, we went from 1 million to 2 million to 4 million to 8 million. So you can imagine that I was pretty keen that we were going to get to 16 million the next year. We didn't. We went down to 5 for one or two reasons. The next year, I'm pleased to say, we went up to 14 million. So we went through a growth period that coincided in part with the emergence of the effective altruism movement. Clue is in the 2 words. People who wish to be altruistic with their giving and have impact for their money to be used effectively. And AMF as an organization has benefited significantly from that movement, that group of people around the world, that growing group of people around the world. And the $14 million a year went to $49 million the next year. So Andrew and I had managed to take AMF over a period of 10 or 11 years to raising $50 million. And the vast majority of that was funding nets. So I think at the time, we're probably talking about $3 a net, maybe a little bit less. So maybe something about 20 million nets that would protect about 36 million people. 1.8 people per net is the number at scale. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, we have raised between $35 and $50 million a year. and then had a very good year last year where we raised $107 million. And now we're a team of 9. So we have a very important group of people who are the operations team, and we have added to Andrew. So we have 2 people in the technical team. So in essence, that's sort of, that's it. There's a technical team of a few people, 2 people, and a very important operations team. And then there are a couple of us who are, I suppose, at the causing trouble across the sort of the management piece as well. So we're 9 people, and to date as an organization, we've raised a little bit north of $360 million, and more than 100 has come in the last year. Yet we still have a significant immediate funding gap. There is a page on our website that talks about that, and in real time we show exactly how we could use money given to us today. And I think currently, as I speak, it probably sits at about $60 million. So we could allocate that instantly because we've approved programs. But the sad reality is that many malaria programs, NET programs, are devoid of funds. They don't have enough. And so nasty choices have to be made as to which countries get support, which regions of a country get support. And I suppose that's very much behind what drives us on each day, our small team of 9, to do as much as we can to fill that gap, and importantly, get nets out, overheads to beds in an effective way as possible. And that brings me on to perhaps the last element that is so important in the work that AMF does, and that is ensuring the nets get to the people who need them. It sounds such a simple thing, but unfortunately, nets have a value. And so they can be stolen at the small level. So a bale of 100 nets that we would buy these days for $200. There is a black market for them, and they sell for $600 to $900. And if you're a health worker, you're earning potentially $150 a month. And so you're looking at a bale of nets that's worth 4 to 6 months' money. So you can see it's understandable that people might want to misappropriate, steal nets, let alone a truck of 10,000 nets arriving with only 7,000 nets because 3,000 have been removed, or 100 container loads of nets arriving and maybe 15 of them disappearing, each having 40,000 nets on board, which means that each container would be going to protect 70,000 people. And so each container that goes missing, those 70,000 people now will not be protected. There's no more nets coming down the track after that. So it's incredibly important that the nets we fund and we ship to Africa and work with our partners to distribute, and we work with governments to distribute, get to the people who need them. And in a few sentences, without going into excruciating detail, what we do is we gather data at the household level. So we establish exactly how many nets each household needs, because each household will have a different number of people and need a different number of nets. And broadly, it's the number of people divided by 2. And so one household may need 4 nets, another 3, another 5, another 2, etc. So it would be incredibly inefficient and ineffective to give a fixed number of nets per household. So by gathering household level data, and importantly, putting it in electronic form, so this data doesn't sit on pieces of paper in many health clinics that you could not check up on in any way. And that's the important point. Being able to look at that data in electronic form, in a database, and interrogate it, analyze it, verify it, get to the point where we have high levels of confidence in the accuracy of the data. And therefore, when we distribute these nets, we can be accountable with our program and effectively our use of money that has been donated to us. And so all of the work we do within the operations team to make sure we're gathering the right information, checking that information, and we check it in a variety of ways that are often very simple. So if you imagine that 100 data collectors are going to go out to a set of villages and visit every household and establish how many people are in each household. So take down the names of the individuals in each household, the gender, the age, etc., and establish how many nets they need. When you have collected that group of 100 data collectors together in advance of them doing that work, and they've gone through some form of training and orientation, what you can say to that 100 people is, thank you very much for the work you're about to do. It's extremely important for the reasons that we've explained in the training program. These 5 people standing on the side here, they're going to go and visit 5% of each of the households that you 100 people visit. Not because we don't trust you, because we don't do trust. We do data. And they're going to ask the same questions of those households that you've asked with no knowledge of the data you collected, so that we gather this independent set of data. And then we're going to compare the 5% where the households overlap. And what that does, for example, is it encourages data collectors to be incredibly accurate with the data they collect. We don't visit 95% of the households. We only revisit 5%. So there's an element of psychology, I guess you could say, where we're just encouraging people to do a really good job. It doesn't cost very much money to do that. And think about the alternative, which is not really understanding whether the data that's collected from the households, collected by local people, because you can't bring people in from tens of kilometers away, far too expensive. There is a temptation to put down a household maybe for 5 nets when they only need 3. Well, that would be a 66% rate of inflation, 2 more nets than they needed. And if that were systemic, then we'd be wasting a huge amount of money. So it's so important to gather accurate data, but it can be done in this really cost-effective way. And even if the data was going to be collected accurately and we're not actually changing behavior, which may well be the case in many circumstances because those data collectors are incredibly honest and full of integrity. But what this additional 5% information allows us to gather, if you like, or develop is a level of confidence that the data is good because we've got corroborating information, evidence, and therefore we can be more confident when we speak to donors about the distribution has happened in the right way with the right number of nets going to people. So 15 years on, being not very good with the remote control of a television has allowed us to build a team and liaise with many donors and others who've been very generous in their support for us. And we continue to do today what we started 15 years ago, which is to use funds entrusted to us as effectively as we can to buy nets, ensure they get overheads and beds, and they protect people when they sleep at night. And now we're at the situation where the number of 747s of children under 5 that die from malaria every day is down to about 2 or maybe 3, not 7. So we've made really good progress, we being all of those organizations that work in malaria control. We are but one organization. There are many, many others. And that means that if we were to look at the progress we've made in 15 years, it's a partial success story. It can't be a total success story because malaria is still with us. It's a partial success story because we've reduced the number of deaths by about 60% over the last 15 years. And in sort of global health terms, that's a really big difference. But the number of people that die each year from malaria is around the 400,000 mark. And the number of people that fall sick is around the 200 million mark. So it is still, well, I'd still call it slaughter. It's still unacceptable because I, and maybe you listening to this with children, you know, our children go to sleep at night, and if they get bitten by a mosquito, it's an annoying itch and a bump. It's not potentially a death sentence. And so more work to be done. And we can bring that number down to very, very low levels so that malaria is, you know, is still existing, but it's not a major health problem anymore. That is achievable. You can eradicate malaria. Sri Lanka as a country in 2017 had gone through 3 years of no native cases of malaria. And in the decades before, had huge problems with malaria, and many people dying and falling sick. So it is not a problem that needs to go on forever. We can fix it. And so that's what keeps me, my colleagues, and many of the organizations that we work with pretty energized, because every day we can make another step towards bringing malaria to a point where it's under control and not the problem that it is today.